Martha Maxwell became a prostitute at age 35. Becoming a lady of the evening all day was not an easy decision for her to make, and it took almost a year to make up her mind. This was not the usual case for prostitution. Martha's only customer was her husband. Martha had known abject poverty and had never had any financial security. She was the eighth child in a family of 10. Her father, Arthur Long, was the town drunk. He died when Martha was 8. The large family subsisted by taking in washings, the boys working on ranches, and mostly on ward fast offerings. Her mother died when Martha was 18. The specter of caring for 2 younger brothers pushed Martha into an early marriage. Fred Maxwell and Martha were married when Martha was 19. Fred was a poor provider. He sheared sheep in the spring and made fairly good money for 2 months. He worked on the local ranches in the summer and fall, but loafed off most of the time in the winter. Martha had 2 sons after 4 years of marriage and resolved to bear no more children. She could see the beginning of the same kind of a family she came from. Fred got the 7-year itch on time and grew tired of family responsibilities. He went away in the winter allegedly looking for work, but never found any. Each year he was gone longer and worked less in the summer and spring. In the spring of 1927 he came home for a week and was gone again. In the summer of 1928 he came home for only 2 days. In the summer of 1929 he sent a postcard from San Francisco. That was the last Martha ever heard from him. The last 4 years during Fred's gradual desertion, Martha had lived mostly off ward fast offerings with a little help from Fred's father. In 1931 she obtained a divorce for desertion. A copy of a divorce decree was sent to the court clerk in the address in San Francisco. It never came back, so Fred apparently had got it. In 1933, Martha's 2 boys, Fred Jr. and Bill, were 10 and 12. During the past 4 or 5 years, Martha had made an effort to help support herself and sons. She did ironing in her home, house cleaning for families in town, and some janitorial work in the school and church. A considerable portion of her support still came from ward fast offerings. In the spring of 1933, Martha went to work for Herbert Evans 3 days a week. She went to his home and did washing, ironing, cooking, and other household tasks. Herbert Evans was a 69-year-old widower. His 2 sons were married and lived in Utah. His wife had died in 1923 and had been an invalid for 10 years before her death. Brother Evans was a moral man and had done no rutting since his wife's death, nor during her 10 years' incapacity. In September of 1933, Herbert Evans asked Martha to marry him. He professed neither love nor passion, but said if she would consent, he would support her and educate the boys, and that she would inherit his property, which was worth about $25,000. This marriage proposal came as a complete surprise to Martha. Her first reaction was one of revulsion. When she saw how serious Herbert was, she said that she would have to think about it. Her intent was to say no in a way that was as painless as possible. She kept postponing the answer time, and many thoughts passed through Martha Maxwell's mind during the winter and spring of 1934. Herbert never pressed her for an answer, but reminded her from time to time that the offer was still open. The longer Martha postponed saying no, the more compelling the reasons she could think to answer in the affirmative. Her security would be assured for life. Her 2 sons perhaps could go to college and on missions. Perhaps she could repay the ward and the kind people who had helped her during her 35 years of poverty. She would have a fine home, an automobile to use, and new clothes. She could mingle with the society of Snowville, yes, even in Paris. Martha was a slim, attractive woman and above average thoracic endowments. Men had been interested in her even before she got rid of that no-good son of a bitch Fred. But she was careful. She wanted nothing to do with men like Fred or her father. With 2 boys to raise, she wanted security, and to hell with romance. Passion in the bed didn't send boys to college. It only made more boys who couldn't go to college. The thought of getting into bed with an old man gave Martha the creeps. Though Brother Evans was not an unattractive man considering he was 70 years old, he was lean and had a weather-beaten face. He was completely bald except for a gray fringe around his ears. He worked 10 hours every day except Sunday at the sawmill. Martha guessed she liked him as well as any 70-year-old man she knew. The final problem that Martha contemplated was that what might be expected to endure by way of sex life. Probably Herbert supposed that he had a few good years left. At age 70, he could be expected to live about 6 more years at most. After that, there might even be time for Martha a romantic marriage. For the next 3 years, once or twice a month was the most an old man could do. After that, if he was still alive, there probably would be separate beds, and sex would only be a memory for Herbert. In her innocence, Martha reasoned that sex would rear its ugly head for 40 or 50 times. Then it would be over. Martha felt a little whorish, even when she contemplated that in exchange for accommodating Brother Evans less than 50 times, she would inherit $25,000 worth of property. Martha could count money, and that amounted to $500 a trick. My Lord, that's the highest price of any place in the world, she gasped. By hell, I'll do it, she said to herself. The spring-December marriage was performed by Bishop Jackson in the Snowville Ward Hall in June of 1934. Immediately after the ceremony, Herbert Evans executed a will, leaving everything to Martha according to his promise. He further had promised that he would not revoke the will, and Martha knew he wouldn't because he was a man of honor. Time would reveal, however, that Herbert Evans was the one who got honor. The ladies in town said Martha married Brother Evans for his money. Martha freely admitted this. Men and boys said the old bastard was senile and off his rocker. Herbert's 2 sons mildly approved of the marriage, reasoning that the old gent would need a nurse in a few years in any event. They didn't know about the will. However, the wedding night was spent in the suite of the Hotel Utah in Salt Lake City. The desk clerk wouldn't let the newlyweds in the room until he saw the marriage certificate. Even then, he had doubts, but there had been a reservation well in advance. Brother Evans occupied his new bride twice within the first hour after they were in the bridal suite. Martha supposed that the exhilaration of the marriage and 20 years of celibacy had combined to play a cruel trick on the old gent, and that he would be knocked out for a month. She was shocked into disbelief when he was trying again in the morning at 5 o'clock. She pretended to be asleep and did not respond. The next night, however, Herbert took up where he had left off on his wedding night. The events of the wedding night set a pattern that would continue for the next 20 years. During the first year of marriage, Herbert demanded and received his due as often as 20 times a month. In his 19th year, he was still trying with varying degrees of success about 10 times a month. In her premarital thinking and planning, Martha had given no thoughts to babies. In the first place, she naively assumed that Herbert was too old to sire a child. Even if he could, she knew how to control that, so she thought. But the law of averages caught up with Martha. It caught up with her 3 times. Safe periods were not enough for Herbert. Martha bore a daughter at age 37, another daughter at age 40, and a son at age 43. She had a miscarriage at age 45, and then there were no more pregnancies. After that first year of marriage, Martha sought sanctuary in the hospital at Paris. Dr. Peck said there wasn't anything wrong with Martha, but upon her insistence, she was placed in the hospital a week for rest and observation. Martha noted that this period was the only time in her year of marriage that Herbert had gone a week without importuning her in bed. When Herbert visited her each night at the hospital, she made sure the door to the room was open. After a week in the hospital, the doctor said she would have to go home because they needed the room for someone who was really sick. At this juncture, Martha leveled with Dr. Peck and told him about Herbert's sex demands. Dr. Peck refused to talk seriously about it. He said, "Get Herbert down here immediately. I would like to study him." "What does he eat and drink? Does he take any herbs or mineral water? Has he been to Dr. Brinkley's clinic?" Dr. Peck was greatly amused. It was not funny to Martha, however. The legend of Herbert Evans took on increased dimensions. As time went on, in 1939, Bishop Jackson paid $400 for a purebred bull that turned out to be impotent. One day, the bishop asked Dr. Anderson, the veterinarian, to come up to the ranch and look at the bull. Dr. Anderson said, "It won't do any good for me to look at your bull. Take the bull down to him and look and let him look at Herbert Evans. In the summer of 1940, Martha asked for a confidential talk with the bishop. She came to the Jackson Ranch early in the evening. After skirting around her problem about half an hour, Martha blurted out that Herbert was just too much for her in bed. She said sometimes he even tried to get her into bed during the noon period and on Sunday afternoons. She said that after the birth of her first daughter, she had to go to Montpelier and stay with her sister for 2 weeks to keep Herbert out of her bed. This was an unbelievable story, the bishop thought. Here was a woman, presumably at the very peak of her sexual desire, married to a 75-year-old man and complaining about the sex demands he made. Frankly, said the bishop, I don't know a thing I can do or even suggest. Perhaps you should both see a doctor, Martha. Martha then told him about seeing Dr. Peck. The bishop thought of a few questions he too would like to ask about Herbert, but he restrained himself. Martha wouldn't leave until the bishop promised to talk to Herbert. The bishop thought for a week on the problem, but still couldn't think of a thing to say to Herbert. This was the damnedest thing, asking a bishop to regulate the sex life of a husband and wife. He had heard about everything and solved many problems, but this was far beyond him. The next Sunday, the bishop talked to Herbert, according to his promise, but only in generalities. Herbert said he was very happy with his marriage and that Martha was everything he had expected and hoped. Martha's visit to the bishop was not mentioned. In his 19th year, Brother Evans was racked with arthritis. He had to be helped from one room to another. All the strength was gone from his arms and legs, but it focused in another extremity. He had to be helped in and out of bed, but once in bed, he was a tiger. Herbert Evans died in bed of a cerebral hemorrhage at 9:30 in the evening when he was in his 91st year. Dr. Peck was at the Evans home 20 minutes after Martha's call and pronounced Herbert dead. Herbert had died in the saddle, figuratively, with his boots on. Martha denied this, but Dr. Peck said he could tell that there was no doubt about it. The doctor, with great admiration, told his nurse of Herbert's last heroic effort. The nurse told everyone in Paris. Thus the legend of Herbert Evans further grew. If Ponce de Leon had spent his lifetime looking for and had discovered Herbert Evans, he would have found his fountain of youth. Herbert died the way all men dream of dying, but he was 1 in 10 million. Martha inherited all the Brother Evans property, valued in 1954 at $40,000. She was an old woman at age 55 and completely worn out. It was much too late for romance, and she had literally had a bellyful of it anyway. Martha calculated grimly that Herbert must have availed himself of the pleasures of the bed at least 2,400 times in the past 20.5 years. This amounted to $16.67 a trick, rather than $500 she had first estimated. That was about what the girls on 25th Street in Ogden received. She had earned every penny of it and would sure as hell need it to raise 3 teenage children.